of the world, just don't slip on it, okay? By the way, if it makes it browner, that's even better. Okay, that way we don't have to, no, never mind. Well, welcome. How many of you love Jesus this morning? Good to see some of our friends back. Hi, guys. We welcome all of our visitors. We are so glad you chose to worship with us. I hope that God meets you here today. I hope that somehow he speaks something through me that touches you in your heart and you say, thank you, Jesus, I needed that. Because that's really what we're here for. We're here to connect with each other and to connect with God, and that's really the whole purpose, isn't it? So I just thank God that you're all here and that you're enjoying the services together. I wanted to tell you a story of a family, and I hope that it reaches into your life. Every family has a history. Every family has a story. And it is significant in our lives. Sometimes we don't realize how much. So I'm going to share this family's story with you. I hope that it inspires you. So Lillian was born in about 1883. And everything about her was negative. She was an angry woman, and she made sure everybody knew about it. She, like most of us, probably at some point in her life, said she didn't want to be like her parents. We don't know what the story is about her upbringing that made her so angry, but something did. All we know is the results weren't good. She had a son named Melvin in 1901. Melvin was a mechanic. He got injured during World War II in the Army and tried to enlist in World War I. And he tried to enlist in World War II, but they wouldn't let him. So he ended up serving as a civilian contractor in Saudi Arabia. Photos from that time of his life show him with many different female companions. He made no secret that he was unfaithful to his wife. Melvin's story is probably like Lillian's, and that he probably at some point said, I do not want to grow up and be like my parents. Agnes married Melvin on June 7th, 1925, at 15 years old. Her and Melvin had a son 8 months later. Agnes was a bit of a wild child. During the time that Melvin was overseas, she had several close friends. Her and Melvin Sr. got divorced after he came home from overseas, and Melvin Jr., their son, blamed his dad for the breakup and never forgave him. Yet, Melvin Jr. had many relationships over the course of his short life. His alcoholism started after he got out of the Navy, and him and his wife, Margaret, had married. They left Portland and moved back to Colton, where he grew up, and he started running with his old friends. Lillian, his grandmother, did not approve of Mel marrying Margaret, and Margaret used to say this. She used to say she was an evil woman. When Margaret was pregnant with her first child, Agnes, all of 4'9", 98 pounds, picked up this pregnant woman and threw her across the room. She was an evil woman. Melvin rarely spoke about her. Part of Melvin's issue was that he was in multiple explosions on the USS Hoggett Bay and suffered from shell shock, PTSD. Of course, they didn't know what PTSD was in his day. During his years on the ship, he only spent 3 months on land duty. That was in San Diego when the ship was sent there for dry dock after the deck was mostly destroyed. He personally watched his fellow shipmates die. He was angry all the time, and he drank a lot. His family once stated that his personality was 180 degrees different after he went into the Navy. He was convicted of vehicular manslaughter, according to the Sun Telegram newspaper in San Bernardino. This is probably the time that Margaret says he disappeared. That's the story she told her children. One of the telling stories about Agnes, Melvin's mother, is that she hated when Melvin Jr. and his father came home dirty. Since Melvin Sr. was a mechanic, that was most of the time. That explains why Melvin Jr. was always so intolerant when things weren't clean to his standards. Can you imagine having 8 kids and expecting them to be spotless? Somebody said it for me. Melvin Jr. at some point in time probably told himself that when he got married, he wouldn't be like his mom and dad. Earl Hedrick Rowland was adopted along with his 2 siblings by the Rowland family after his mother passed away. His birth father was R.C. Hedrick, and after his wife died, he could not raise the kids. So he sent them off to the Rowland family, and they adopted all 3 of them. From all accounts, it was a loving family, and he had a great childhood. There's always a bright spot, isn't there? Earl married Mabel Vietz, and they had Virginia, Hardin, Margaret, and Patricia. Virginia was born in 1912, Hardin in 1916, Margaret in 1926, and Pat in 1931. Mabel was 39 years old when Margaret was born, and Margaret was a handful. Pat was a rebellious child. Virginia, Hardin, and Margaret all went to Northwestern College. Virginia to be a teacher and Hardin a minister. Margaret ended up being sent home at the end of her first year there. She used to say that it was because she suffered an illness. My brother Don read the story after she passed away. She had to leave school because she went off with her boyfriend and traveled and lived together out of wedlock. She was involved with a guy named Bud. What a great name, right? Bud. She ran off with Bud. So after she got back home, she spent a year at home, and then she went off to Portland to Multnomah Bible College, where she later met Melvin Jr. and got married. They had a rocky relationship. They actually ended up breaking up and then coming back together after a few months and getting married. The stories of Grandma Agnes were that, Mabel. The stories of Grandma Mabel were that she was a taciturn person. That's my brother Don's terminology, taciturn. She was a stickler for rules. And I love this. So if you're a Baptist, please don't be offended. She was a stickler for rules and very much a Baptist in her approach to living. I have no idea what that means, but that's the way he puts it. Mom was sent to live with Hardin and Viv when she was 14 years old because Grandma couldn't get her to live by her rules. After Virginia and Hardin were gone, Grandma not only had to raise 2 kids, but she had tenants and boarders to make ends meet. She had no patience with misbehavior and let it be known. On the other hand, Grandpa, well, he was an easygoing guy, and he would just go away into his workshop and make toys. And so Grandma had to deal with everything. By the time I remember her and my grandpa, they were much older than my dad's parents, probably about 20 years difference. Grandma refused to let Mom leave my dad and used the old adage, "You made your bed." After Grandpa died in 1960, we rarely saw our grandmother. She went to live with Hardin and Viv, and we really never got to know her. I have one memory of my grandmother coming in and visiting us. We were living in this apartment complex that were literally the slums. We were very poor. And I remember running in the bedroom to ask my mom a question, and my mom was in her underclothes. She wasn't naked, she was in her underclothes, and my grandmother freaked out, chased us out of the room like she was going to beat us because we saw my mother in her underclothes. That was totally inappropriate. It's my total memory of my grandmother. I think Margaret probably at some point said, I don't want to grow up when I get married and be like my mom. The biggest takeaway with our parents and grandparents is that there was not a ton of positive relationships in them. There was a lot of destructive behaviors. Dad and his dad never stopped fighting each other. His mom really didn't want anything to do with any of us. When her last husband passed away, actually when Melvin Sr. passed away, my oldest brother Gary and my brother Don wanted to go to his funeral, and my dad wouldn't let him go because he carried that hatred and unforgiveness so strong. That broke Don's heart. Donnie remembers Grandpa. I remember Grandpa, he used to come over, this used to drive my mom crazy. Grandpa would always come up behind us, and he'd punch us on the nose. It was his thing. And then the other thing he did that drove my mom crazy is he'd always take his dentures out right in front of us. He thought that was the greatest thing ever. And we are kids like, oh, right? Mom just hated that, but oh well. It was his thing, Donnie tells me this story that when him and his wife headed off to Hawaii with YWAM, he had a long talk with Dad about this unforgiveness in his life. And that if Dad wanted God to forgive him, he needed to deal with those issues in his own life. He said he will never know how he took it because he didn't respond. Issues in this family are infidelity, alcoholism, rebellion, anger, abuse, hate, generational curses that I saw when I became a Christian, and I made the decision that those would not follow me into my relationships. I told myself, I will not be like my parents when I get married. Donnie said that the hardest thing for him to break has always been the anger. Anger at Dad and some of his siblings. And Don said this, he said, the model we were given didn't teach us how to deal with it. I think this story could be millions of families. Many of us grow up saying, when I get married, I'm not going to be anything like my parents. Only to discover later on that we behave just like them. We find ourselves in the same destructive behaviors, the same patterns, and we can't figure out why or how to make it stop. Our perceptions are so influenced by our upbringing that we sometimes don't even know how ingrained they are. Destructive patterns are much harder to break than we realize. It begs two questions. How do we stop the madness and make it quit? And how do we get beyond the destruction? I only know one way, and it begins with God. I told you this story last week. I told you the story about how God healed me of my anger. For those that weren't here, anger was the hardest thing for me to overcome in my personal life. because I was so angry at my dad. My wife suffered the consequences of that for a very short period in our wedding, in our marriage. Don't ask her if that's true or not. It was a lot shorter to me than it was for her. But I had told you guys the story of how we were at a men's retreat and the Holy Spirit was moving powerfully in men's lives and just doing amazing things. And my buddy and I went to the chapel and prayed and talked about my anger and how I surrendered it to God in that moment. And I felt that fireball just started in my stomach that's been sitting there and festering all my life. And it just like a fireball shot right out through the top of my head. And I felt peace like I'd never felt before. I felt like I wasn't holding on to anything anymore. I was set free. I couldn't do that on my own. And as many things that I'd tried to get over that anger, nothing worked until I surrendered it to God. Realizing that we need God is really the first step. Psalm 40:17 says this. I love the Psalms. I don't know about you guys, but I love the Psalms. Psalm 40:17 says this. But as for me, I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverance. You are my God. Do not delay. How many times have we asked God to help us and then said, please don't delay? God is in the business of restoring lives. God is in the business of breaking generational curses. God is in the business of breaking destructive behaviors. It's what he does. It's what he desires for all of us. And Dick gave me this scripture last week, and I wanted to share it with you this week because it was so good. 1 John 4:4. My dear children, isn't that, God says, my dear children, you are from God, and he has overcome them, because the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. No matter what destructive patterns and behaviors you have learned, God is bigger than that person and bigger than that problem. But you have to give it to him. You have to be willing to let it go. Do you know why we hold on to these behaviors that are so destructive? Because we identify with them. We think that's who we are. For instance, I know people that will say, I am an angry person. Well, of course you're an angry person. You said you were. So what do you think you're going to be? Or the person that says, I am addicted to pornography. Well, of course you are, because you said you are. Well, I'm an alcoholic. Well, of course you are, because you said you are, and so on and so forth. I know people that say that they own illnesses in their bodies that don't belong to them. Did you hear what I just said? I'm going to use my wife as a story. That's okay, sweetie? Just say yes. She said yes. I'm in so much trouble. My wife, almost 20 years ago, was attacked physically by arthritis. It's an affliction of the enemy. For all you people that think you have arthritis, hear me out. We had a healing service at our church, and I had everyone come up to the front. I didn't lay hands on anybody. I take no credit for anything. But I had each person in that room pray, and this is how we prayed. I declare that I am not arthritis. I declare I don't have asthma. I declare whatever your affliction was, and they rebuked it, and they renounced it, and guess what happened to my wife? She was healed. Up to that point, she had always said, I have arthritis. She identified with it. So guess what? The arthritis belonged to her. She rebuked it and didn't own it anymore. Does she still have some symptoms? Yes. Because the enemy's not going to let her go that easy. But as a rule, she's arthritis free because she doesn't own it. She doesn't identify with it. See, we own things that aren't ours, that don't belong to us, because we think somehow, because the world teaches that we should believe it. And the word doesn't agree with that at all. God says, I will not inflict the afflictions of my enemies on my children. That's what God says about us. That doesn't mean the enemy's not going to try to attack us in any way possible. We don't have to own it. We don't have to put up with it. We can put our foot down, because greater is he that is in us than he who is in the world. Okay, I just got fired up. We got to quit owning stuff that doesn't belong to us. We got to quit owning our past. Just because you were raised a certain way doesn't mean you have to be that way. Now keep the good stuff. Okay? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Did I say that right? I said a saying right. It's a miracle. Don't own the junk that you don't have to own. I know people that get up in the morning and say, I have to have a drink before I do anything else. And they're believers. How is that possible? Because they don't know that greater is God that is in them than the one that told them they had to be that way. What are you owning that doesn't belong to you? You know what it is. I don't have to tell you. You know, because God is pointing it out to you. Greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. All right, say this with me. Are you ready? Greater is he. Greater is he. Greater is he who is in me than he who is in the world. That's your mantra for the week, folks. Walk in that. Believe it. Don't just say it. Realizing that our need for God is a big step. Allowing God to change our perceptions is a much bigger process. It's a process that's going to take time, and that's what we're going to be doing for the next few weeks. We're going to be fleshing out what does it look like to have the power to change. Please come. Please come. It could change your life, if you will allow it. Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired yet? Because if you are, God's just waiting for you. He's just waiting. He's been in the business of restoring lives longer than we've been around. And if he could do it for your parents, my dad, he died at 54 years old from his destructive behaviors. Okay? He was disabled at the age of 32 years old. He could no longer work after 32 years old with 8 kids. He was angry and he was bitter. He hated his life. And here's the interesting thing that got me. My dad told my mom this on their wedding night. She said to him, "I'm not marrying you because I love you. I'm marrying you so you could have kids." My reaction completely. Now here's the interesting thing to me. He was so angry at us all the time. Why did he want 8 kids? Is somebody to put his anger out on? I don't know. Because he was caught up in the loop of destructive behaviors and he couldn't get out of it. After my dad got sick, for 15 years straight, we went to the hospital once a year because we were sure my dad was going to die. Because he was put in the hospital and he put on respirators and he had half a lung on this side and a half a lung on this side from smoking and drinking. Okay? I remember going 3 years before he died. My dad and I, we didn't talk much. We talked at each other, mostly with very loud voices. But I remember that I just felt in my heart that it was getting to that point where he needed to change his mind about God because his life was always at the point of ending. I knew that he would not listen to me. Even though he knew I was saved, he would not listen to me. So I asked my best friend to go to the hospital with me and visit my dad. No one else was around. And I asked my friend if he would just talk to my dad about Jesus. And we prayed before we went, and we went to the hospital. And I stood outside the room because I knew my presence would interfere with whatever God was going to do. And so I just stood outside the room and I just prayed that God would somehow speak his love through my best friend, Al. My best friend started talking to my dad. And the next thing I know, he's holding his hand and praying with him. And for the last 3 years of my dad's life, he reconnected with God. Because greater is he that is in us than he who is in them. That can be your story. For you guys that are separated from loved ones, it can be restored. For you guys that grew up with abuse, there's healing and recovery available. Where there's been serious abuse, there can be healing and restoration. But you have to ask for it. God, I am needy. I need you. And do not delay. And if you will believe that, God can do a miracle for you. If you will believe it. Most of the information I'm getting, a lot of the stuff I'm getting is from this great book right here. He's a dear friend of mine. He's an evangelist that goes around the world. He's an evangelist to mostly South American, Latin American countries. This is the #1 selling book in Cuba. Power to Change by Jason Friend. We went to Cuba with him, and people flocked to him to try to get close to have him pray for them. When we ended our services, we had a service every morning and every night. It was great. People would flock to the front for prayer. You know how we asked for you guys to come and pray at the end of service, and like 2 or 3 of you might come up? You know, on a good Sunday, maybe 4 of you. In Cuba, everyone came. There was not enough room because they said, I am needy. And Lord, you are my salvation. You are my deliverer. And I need you. Do not delay. Where did we lose that, church? Where did we get away from saying, God, I need you? Where did we stop saying as a whole group of people, God, we need you. Please come. Do not delay. Instead, we go, great message, Pastor. I got to go to lunch. Nothing wrong with going to lunch. But what about that spot that God was touching you in the whole time you were here? Where he was saying, you need me here. And I'm here today. I'm here right now. I will not delay if you don't. Where did we lose that, church? Where did we start saying, nah, that's for other people? When all of us in this room have some destructive behaviors that we are carrying that don't belong to us. And God is just waiting for us to say, here I am, Lord, I need you. All it takes is standing up and coming up. That's all it takes. And he'll meet you. So I invite you this morning, as I do every week. Maybe you're here today and you've never had a personal relationship with Jesus. We can help you with that. We invite you to come to get to know him. Maybe you're here today and you're far away from him because you don't feel like he's near. He says, come to me. Maybe you're here because you're just sick and tired of being sick and tired. If God has said anything to you today, number one, I'm grateful that he spoke to you. Number two, don't leave. Don't leave without doing business with God. We have elders that will stay here and pray with you. Jim and the worship team are going to play quietly, and they're going to sing a closing song. Anyone that would like someone to pray with them for anything in your life, please don't hesitate. Just come forward, knowing that we will pray with you and for you, and there will be no judgment.